On debate, Senator Deacon, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Speaker. Colleagues, when I look at expansive, complex, and controversial legislation like Bill C-10, I try to keep the problem that the legislation is trying to solve firmly in my focus. In this case, this seemingly simple objective proved challenging. So I went back to the genesis of the bill, which was the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review announced in Budget 2017. It had the task of examining issues such as telecommunications, content creation, net neutrality, and cultural diversity in the digital age, and how to strengthen the future of Canadian media and content creation. The purpose was to examine the existing legislative framework and tools in the context of the digital age and identify changes needed to support the government in meeting these objectives. That 2017 announcement spawned the Yale Commission, as we all know, its report in 2020, and subsequently this legislation. So the problem that Bill C-10 is intended to solve is to define the legislative framework of tools that will strengthen the future of Canadian media and content creation in this rapidly digitizing world and in a country with tremendous cultural diversity. So I want to begin with a few general observations about regulation in Canada and reflect on how the CRTC's actions and statements provide insight as to how they view competition. I'll then discuss the regulatory platforms upon which the objectives of C-10 rest, and finish with some questions that I hope the Standing Committee on Transportation and Communications will consider. According to the OECD's Product Market Regulation Indicator, which is an economy-wide measure of the degree to which regulations promote or inhibit competition, Canada is 35th out of 38 OECD member countries, ahead of only Turkey, Colombia, and Costa Rica. Indeed, Canada ranks last in this 2018 OECD report as it relates to the regulatory burden associated with business operations, a measure that considers retail price controls, public procurement, and command and control regulations. In a country that already has one of the most overregulated in the world, we should be streamlining, not expanding, regulatory regimes. We cannot afford more regulatory complexity, duplication, confusion, and control. Simply overly complex, burdensome regulation limits investment in innovation, which is much needed to stimulate the creation of highly skilled jobs, deliver better services to consumers at lower costs, and fuel the success of our exporters. One particular statement made by the sponsor when introducing C-10 got my attention. It was that C-10 will expand the legislative and regulatory regime to include online broadcasters by confirming that the CRTC has regulatory jurisdiction and control over these services. My question is, how can we possibly achieve this goal, which is to strengthen the future of Canadian online media and content creation in a rapidly digitizing world, where borders are increasingly digitally porous, without first focusing on our foundational privacy and competition laws? Updating our privacy and competition laws will better empower Canadians and our economy in this digital era. They are the platform, the foundation upon which C-10 must be built if it's to achieve its purpose. Otherwise, an increasingly complex web of regulatory burdens will create countless unintended consequences and continue to diminish our ability to compete, not strengthen it. I also find the pace of reform troubling, and especially in the context of Bill C-10. Our many regulators have been slow to respond to the global market realities that have disadvantaged Canadian businesses and consumers. I strongly doubt that these regulators will become more responsive as we increase regulatory burden and complexities. In a globally competitive world, Canada continues to sit at the crossroads as it relates to the role of government in sectors where technology, business models, customer needs, habits, and expectations are all changing at an ever-increasing pace. I increasingly worry that we continue to sit at this crossroad while many of our regulators, including the CRTC, seem to continue to underestimate the speed and strength of global market forces and competition. And for those who think that we've already seen a lot of change and we needn't be too worried, I recall the words of BTO, "You ain't seen nothing yet." If we're to compete in this rapidly digitizing world, we need to build competitive marketplaces. These marketplaces empower consumers and drive businesses to become more innovative and productive, improve product quality, and decrease prices. One way for regulators to not increase competitiveness is to mandate private companies towards the services they are to deliver or how they should invest. In this light, past and current announcements made by the CRTC provides insight into the thinking that may have guided at least some of the development of C10. Specifically, a recent CRTC statement observed that Canadians want to have better access to affordable wireless service for their cell phones and other mobile devices. Now, that's a CRTC statement that would garner the support of virtually every Canadian. But it was the next bit that was troubling, and I quote the CRTC: "We therefore are expecting Bell, Rogers, TELUS, and SaskTel to offer and promote low-cost and occasional use plans." The CRTC went on to state that these providers are expected to offer these plans by July 14th, 2021, and that the CRTC also specified the expected levels of service and the maximum prices. Colleagues, this provides evidence as to why we lead the OECD in the imposition of command and control regulations, which are counter to productivity growth. In an earlier but related news release, CRTC Chair and CEO Ian Scott was quoted as saying, while there are encouraging signs that prices are trending downwards, we need to accelerate competition and more affordable options for Canadians. We will never strengthen the future of Canadian media and content creation in the context of this rapidly digitizing and increasingly competitive world by issuing what are effectively decrees. For that reason alone, I'm not a fan of the CRTC determining changes to our competition laws by default. Colleagues, so far I have observed that Canada already has a weighty regulatory burden, that the CRTC does not look at competition in a way that is supported by competition law across the OECD and other peer countries. I contrast the approach Canada is taking with the ones taken by Australia, the UK, and the EU. Each of these jurisdictions has chosen to ensure that their primary regulators, their privacy and competition regulators, had the authority, capacity, and resources necessary to engage effectively in all markets faced with digital disruption. They employed a whole of government approach and did not let the platform regulations become fragmented. These jurisdictions have recognized that the creation, collection, and maintenance of consumer data can drive unprecedented levels of innovation and generate tremendous benefits for both consumers and businesses. However, without proper privacy and competition controls, harms emerge at an increasing pace. Today, digital platforms are threatening the very existence of traditional media, as we all know. The reason why is a consequence of current market realities. Let's say you have a great product and you're looking to advertise. Why pay a broadcaster to advertise to a mass audience when a digital platform can precisely deliver that same ad to the exact profile of buyer who's already looking for the kind of solution your product delivers? No wonder the value of mass media advertising has plummeted, taking our newsrooms with it. How can broadcasters possibly remain viable when digital platforms have free access to data that gives them a powerful content distribution advantage? How can they remain viable when they have none of the regulatory guardrails that the broadcasters must adhere to? Our current legislative and regulatory process has taken more than a decade to respond to this pressing market reality. That's far too slow. We've got to become more agile. One way to become more agile is to keep intensely focused on the outcomes that our regulations must achieve and not create overlapping regulatory levers. This need for greater agility is yet another reason why I believe C10 cannot achieve its intended outcomes without being built on top of updated competition and privacy legislation. Here I'm going to quote our current competition commissioner, Matt Boswell. And he quotes, and I quote, "Competition fosters economic growth by empowering individuals and pushing businesses to make the best use of their resources and innovate by developing new ways of doing business and winning customers. Simply put, competition drives productivity, which improves our global competitiveness. To date, many big tech players have taken full advantage of weak privacy protections and competition laws. Big tech are data vacuums, and we're at the wrong end. This provides them with a staggeringly unfair competitive advantage. And don't take my word for it. Take Mark Zuckerberg's word for it when, as a 21-year-old CEO of the Facebook, as it was called then, clearly stated in a famous 2005 interview that the platform was specifically designed to cause people to share information that they probably otherwise would not. That situation continues today. I hope that you understand why I believe that our success in strengthening Canadian media and content creation and distribution is dependent on our updating the privacy legislation that will allow consumers to regain control over their data, and on strengthening the competition laws that create a level playing field. So as I wrap up, I respectfully ask that our colleagues in the Standing Senate Committee on Transportation and Communications consider 3 questions as they work to identify and question each of the witnesses intended to help in their critical review of this legislation. First, how do we ensure that Bill C-10 will strengthen the future of Canadian media and content creation without creating conflicting and competing with expected and urgently needed updates to our privacy and competition laws? Second, how do we ensure that we empower the private sector with an agile regulatory framework that embraces global market realities, empowering and enabling content creators, broadcasters, and media companies to innovate and become and remain globally competitive? And third, how do we ensure that the resulting regulatory framework and tools ultimately incentivize the creation of content and assets that generate recurring revenue? Recurring revenue is a foundational source of wealth and prosperity. If we just focus on the jobs and incomes and not the ownership of assets we create, our media and the assets we create, our media and content creators will never generate the recurring low-cost revenue that is the foundation of wealth creation, especially in the digital era. We have heard a lot about the complexities here from our previous speakers just this evening. Colleagues, global market forces and consumer behavior are the final arbiters in the digital era, not regulators. Increased regulation does not result in increased competition. It results in the opposite. It creates increased barriers for the disruptive new entrants who can deliver dramatically improved services and greater value. It prevents them from ever getting a toehold in the market. I'm with Senator Simons and other speakers. After a flurry of last-minute amendments and all the misunderstandings and misinformation, this bill is in desperate need of a thorough Senate study and revision. I hope that you consider the 3 questions that I've asked as you select and question witnesses. Let's stay focused on creating the conditions that will increasingly empower Canadian creativity, culture, and competitiveness into an ever more digital and disruptive future. Thank you, colleagues.